All right, everyone. Today we're going to start talking about API views. Specifically, we're going to cover functional-based views, which we already did a small introduction to last Thursday. Then we're going to dive into how we can tie our URL patterns into specific applications. We're then going to turn those functional-based views into class-based views utilizing Django REST frameworks. And we're also going to talk about the why. And then from there, we'll talk about registering specific converters. We'll talk about what is a converter since we talked about URL parameters, but we haven't necessarily gave them their proper name just yet. And then we'll dive into specific views of grabbing one instance and returning one instance's information. All right. Does anyone have any questions over what we'll be covering today? Perfect. In that case, let's go ahead and start our slide deck here of RESTful API design for getting all. So here we go. What is a RESTful API? We have our database or REST service, our web server, and then we have our RESTful API. Right? We've seen this drawing a couple of times, either hand drawn by myself or Adam, or utilizing some other sorts of images to represent each specific portion. Essentially, you'll have a React application that's being hosted inside of some sort of Chrome browser or in a browser in general. Maybe it's an application inside of somebody's phone. But what we've learned so far is that that React template is essentially just empty code. It is an empty skeleton that requires data in order to work. When we made our Rick and Morty API, our Rick and Morty API, for example, our characters page, it's one simple component that's being mapped through and generating information. So that skeleton needs info to be able to generate that information, generate content for the user. So when we were working in React as front-end developers, we made a request to the Rick and Morty API. From there, we grabbed the data that we needed. But when we made that request to the Rick and Morty API, there was a lot happening in the background, right? So we sent a request over. That got processed through URL patterns to be able to match a view. That then went over to some sort of API view that was able to query the database. Right? We queried the database. Data gets returned as a query set. We then serialized that query set to turn it, excuse me, to turn it into JSON readable data. And then we returned that JSON object back to the client to be able to render information. So we're going to dive into that here today. All right. So there we go. So think about Facebook or Instagram. All the information we see on our screen is not already loaded in the application. Instead, when you open the application, a request is sent to grab all the posts that may pertain to you to render it into HTML for the user. Now, the RESTful API design is when you open up Facebook, there's some sort of function that makes an HTTP request or a RESTful API that's being hosted somewhere on the internet. In this specific example, we're talking about a GET request to a URL that may resemble something like this. Well, we have our HTTP, facebook.com, and then we see a URL pattern that matches an API. We know this is an API because they have it classified as API. Now, as we're creating our URL patterns in Django, you'll realize that this is just something that we're simply writing ourselves, the API portion and the V1 portion, which is just creating a version for the current state of our API. And although it is just a string that we ourselves are creating, we're going to see the importance of it once we go into hosting our application. So it's important that as you're building it now, although you may not understand the importance of it just yet, to get into the habit of whenever you create a project, always utilize the API slash V1 or V2 or whichever convention or whichever version you're currently in. But you want to ensure that you label your API with the endpoint starting at API. All right. Any questions so far? Perfect. Now the web server, the request was sent to our hosted endpoint and is then passed to the server hosting and handling these URL endpoints. Now Facebook is loading and is waiting for the server to send back a response with all of the posts and information it wants to show to the user. So we know that as an asynchronous request, we utilize .then if we don't have any sort of asynchronous handle inside of a function. But this is the part where we're telling our React application to wait for information to be sent back. Now, while the React application is waiting for information to be sent back, the server is talking to the database to grab a query set. So now the server may or may not query the database to get, put, post, or delete data depending on what the user requests. The Facebook server queries the database to grab all of your friends, recent activities, ads, and other information that the front end wants to render. All right, and here we see the entire cycle here. So we send a request to get all post. That then goes to an API view. The API view grabs a query from the database. The query set gets returned back to the server. That then gets serialized and gets sent back as a JSON response with all of the posts. All right, any questions? Perfect. If there aren't any questions, then let's go ahead and start looking at some code. Starting out, oh, we do have a question. Go ahead, Andy.
Sorry, take your time. Some of the APIs, I know some of them APIs were user friendly as in like turning the data into JSON format because it like explicitly states it for you. Are there some servers that don't do that?
Got you. So you're saying, are there any APIs that will not respond in a JSON format?
Right. And if so, like how would we know when that happens?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not interacted with any APIs that would respond anything outside of a JSON format. There are many types of different files that could be responded with. Um, I'm gonna go on an assumption here that APIs in general will always respond in a JSON format. And in the case that they do not, they do explicitly state it inside of their documentation. If you take a look at any URL endpoint or a description of an API and they're telling you, hey, this is what the API does, there's always going to be a part in that documentation that says the response will be an application slash JSON. And that's how you know what the response is going to be coming in as. Does that answer your question, Andy?
Yeah, it makes sense. I just thought if they explicitly state that it's going to be in JSON format, I thought maybe um some others don't do that, but that makes sense.
Yeah, I would have to take a look into seeing something else. I'll have to find some examples. All right, let's go ahead and push forward here into our URLs. And actually, let me clean up our playground here since this is a brand new lesson. We're not going to need this. And it looks like I'm having a problem with my Python interpreter. If I go over to my serializers, so I can see that my Python environment isn't being recognized. So I'm just going to fix that really quick. Going to go into which Python 3, open up the command palette. Oh, probably should have copied this first. So I'll copy this, open up the command palette, go into Python interpreter, enter interpreter path, paste my Python environment. There you go. So now it's able to recognize all of my dependencies inside of this Python environment. Great. So first thing to talk about, it's going to be plugging in URL patterns to specific applications. So far what we saw here in URLs, we were able to create a couple of functional based views, and we're triggering these functional based views inside of the project. But just in these three functions, our files are already getting a little bit packed up. And if I were to try to squeeze all of my URL patterns inside of just one file, well, that might cause a little bit of an issue. I might have a file that ends up being hundreds of lines of code, especially if I'm also writing my views in here. So there's got to be a way to account for that. Well, currently we're utilizing only path, but now we need to include the URL patterns in other applications. Here's what I mean by that. I'm going to come over to path and bring down a function called include. This happened here on line 18. It's coming from Django URLs. Now, what that function is going to allow me to do is I can now create a path saying API slash v1 slash Pokemon. And this should route me to my Pokemon app. So I can go ahead and route to Pokemon app URL patterns and views. Well, we know that the path function requires two arguments. All right, what are those two arguments that it requires?
A URL and what to do when that URL is hit.
All right, so we have the URL pattern, which is described here on the left-hand side. And then we have an action, which is described by a function. And in this case, the function that we'll utilize will be the include function. Now, the include function, what it does is we can describe an app and a file to include in these URL patterns. So knowing that, if I wanted to include my Pokemon app, well, it would look as such. I would say Pokemon app dot URLs. Right? And what include will do, the request will come in. It will follow this API pattern. And it'll say, oh, well, wherever I can find this functionality, it's going to be inside of the Pokemon app dot URLs. So we open up the Pokemon app, and in here, there's no URL patterns. Again, we can fix that by adding a URLs.py. All right. Now, in this URLs.py, I'm going to say from Django.urls, I'm going to import path. And here I'm going to create my own URL patterns. So for now, let's just say path. I'm going to leave it at index. And then I'll make a functional view here. I'll say this. Let's go with all Pokemon. And we know that every single URL view, or excuse me, every single API view is going to receive a request. And we could return, oh, let's go from Django, HTTP. We can return an HTTP response that says all Pokemon. And then we could tie in that view of all Pokemon. All right. So let's try to cover this down a little bit in a more visual standpoint here. Let's see. So we have our project URLs. And inside of our project URLs, we have the following patterns. Go ahead and clean this up a little bit. But we want to include other patterns. And these other patterns that we want to include are happening here, where we're saying, hey, actually, when we include this, I also want you to show me what's inside of my Pokemon app patterns. So I come here, and here's my patterns for my Pokemon app. So what ends up happening is every single time somebody pings the pattern here, oh, excuse me, the pattern down below, which is for my URLs, my application is going to simply send a request to the Pokemon app URLs and finish up there. So for example, if I were to write HTTP localhost port 8000 API/v1/Pokemon, that would ping the all Pokemon function, right? It would follow the URL pattern API/v1/Pokemon. That includes my URL patterns in my Pokemon app.urls. But because there's no following entry, it goes straight to the all Pokemon function. Does anyone have any questions about that?
This is functionally no different than having it all in one file. It just allows for organization and modularity, right?
That's correct, yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's test it out. We just did a bunch of things in theory, but we haven't seen it in action. Let's do Python. Oh, might want to change directory to my actual project here. You'll see Python, manage py, and then run our server. All right, our server is running. All of my migrations have been applied. I don't see anything different here. I come over to my URL pattern. That doesn't work because I don't have anything for index. I go to API/v1/Pokemon. And then I get back this all Pokemon function. Awesome. So everything's working great so far. I've been able to tie in my URL patterns, include my new application, where I was able to create a functional base view and have it return a response. Let's close down our project for now, since we're not going to need that for a little bit. All right. Well, we just talked about modularity and the single responsibility principle. And to me, it just seems wrong to have views inside of the same file as my URL patterns. So views should probably exist somewhere else to allow for logic and complexity so that my file doesn't get too overfilled. Well, there's an entire file inside of an app named views. And that's actually where I'll be able to write my API views. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to take it out, and bring it in to my API views. But now I'm getting an error. I'm getting told, hey, all Pokemon doesn't exist because it's not defined. I know I created it. So what's the issue here?
You need to import it to link the files together.
Perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and say from views, I want to import all Pokemon. I can specify from this views. There you go. And now if I refresh my page, you'll see that my request is able to be processed correctly and a response is being able to send out. Great. Well, currently I'm able to receive a request. Now there's specific behavior that we haven't talked about yet when it comes to API views. And this behavior is called CRUD. This can be a quick introduction to CRUD, where a GET request is being sent to read information. A PUT request is sent to update information. A post request is sent to create information. And then finally, our delete request is sent to delete information. So let me see if I can fix this real quick. There you go. CRUD. All right. Now, with that said, this is all just API convention or what an API should do and how it should behave. But there's nothing hard coded that says this is how it's going to work. I myself have to create the logic that has this restriction upon my API so that post requests coming in can only create information, get requests coming in can only read information, and so on. So I have to enforce this myself. It's not going to happen automatically through my server or whenever I'm generating an API. And we can access this by seeing the request.method. So when I go to refresh this, we can see that the request.method is get. So I can do something like, hey, if request.method, oh, hello, is equal to get, then I want you to return the following. Otherwise, I want you to return HTTP response of, uh, let's just go with error. All right, so this is going to work great whenever I'm utilizing this API/v1 Pokemon. I'm doing it through the browser because we're not going to actually see an error coming up here. And I'm not going to introduce us into Postman yet, but I will introduce us. Actually, let's go ahead and do a quick introduction to Postman. All right, Postman's going to be an additional tool. Let me go ahead and run this here to grab it. Postman is free, and it will allow you all to create your own your your own account. You can download it into your application or you could host it on the browser. If you're inside of the browser, it's only going to work with deployed applications. All right, so I can go into Postman and interact with deployed applications. But if you want it to work with your local host, you need to install Postman. Now let's take a look at Postman and see what it looks like. Oh, come on. There you go. Oh, that's really slow. There you go. Postman. So Postman is going to be a tool that we can utilize to test APIs. Specifically, any sort of request that we have, we want to make sure that we can write it in here. So I can click the plus sign. It's going to bring me to this overview page. And in this plus sign, I can specify where is it that I want to send my URL request. So for example, I'm a front-end developer. I want to test my API capabilities or the API that I'm currently working with. I'm currently working with the Poke API. I want to see how it works. I'm going to go ahead and copy this URL pattern, bring it in, and I can see a couple of performance issues, or I can see a couple of performance varieties. Here I can see that I have my headers, which currently is showing me that there are none other than the defaults already in there. Looks like 7 are hidden. I can unhide them. So I see the host there, the user agent. Postman does really well at dealing with cores as well. I can specify a body, which we can have in raw JSON as well. We can execute scripts and tests, which a lot of backend developers utilize Postman to actually write some automated tests for their API. All right, so let's go ahead and send this request here to Ditto. So this request is sent. I can see a little bit of information here. can see that I was processing 200 okay. It shows me some sort of information here. It took 402 milliseconds. I was waiting the majority of that request. It shows me the response size, the request size. I can come into the headers of the response and see all of that. See if there's any cookies that were generated as well. And then go into the body. So there it shows me my entire API endpoint for Postman. Now, let's apply it to our API. This is going to be HTTP / 127.0.0.1 at port 8000. We go to API / v1 / Pokemon. Then I send my request. All I get back is my HTTP request of all Pokemon. It's the same exact thing as if I were doing it through the browser, right? But currently, I am handling for a GET request. Well, now I want to handle for some sort of other request. What if it was a put request or a delete request? That's where that else statement comes in. We'll see that if I put post in there and I send my request, in my response, it looks like I get back an invalid response or a 403 forbidden. All right. Oh, and that's happening because of course. Okay. If I send back a put request, it looks like I'm getting the same thing. I'm getting a cross-origin resource. So that's the CSRF token where I can't actually send or exchange information. And we are going to fix that here shortly utilizing our API views. So there's quite a bit of complexity that we're doing here just to get our application to work and to reinforce such a thing as methods. Well, again, there's got to be a better way to handle these views and make them more developer friendly, for lack of better words. Currently, I have a functional based view, but maybe I can have something that will be more in a class-based view with a lot of built-in functionality to be able to return effective responses. This is where Django REST framework is going to come back into play. I'm going to go ahead and go into REST framework. And from views, I'm going to import an API view. And same thing from REST framework dot response, I will import a response. So I can send back responses as well. We're going to take this all Pokemon view and turn it into a class-based view. I'm going to say class all Pokemon, which is going to inherit from the API view. And then I'm going to specify the method. Rather than saying, hey, and if the request method is get, I'm going to say for the request method of get, this is OP, so the very first argument should always be self. And the second argument should be request. I want to return, and we'll just say HTTP response. We'll just copy this very exact line again. All right. Now I'm getting a problem by URL patterns, which I expect here. All Pokemon no longer exist. Instead, it's all Pokemon. And I want us all to pay attention to this error down below. It's going to tell me, hey, this URL pattern has an invalid view. If you want to pass a class-based view, you have to utilize the .asView method instead of just all Pokemon. So now this .asView method is a method that is inherited from the API view. And what it does is it allows this URL pattern to be interpreted as a functional base view, right? Because Django is a functional program. We need to make sure that we specify, hey, I want you to analyze this class-based view as a functional base view. It's kind of like a converter per se. Well, now let's go back into sending our GET requests. Make sure this still works properly. Great. If I send back a put request now I'm getting this method is not allowed. I'm no longer worrying about a CSS-RF error, which is happening with cores. Now it's all being handled through the API view. Right? If I send back a post request, I still get, hey, the post method is not allowed. And same thing for a delete request. Let me do a quick recap over everything we've done up to this point. We started off in the Pokédex project where we created a URL pattern to include the Pokemon URLs, the Pokemon app URLs. We then went over to the Pokemon app URLs and created our own URL patterns that are going to exist within the Pokemon app. Came down to views, where in views we established that there is a certain number of methods that can be passed to an API view. So the easiest way to handle that is with a class-based view that inherits from the API view inside of Django REST framework, where we can write a function that responds to a method. This if request method here is equal to get is the same exact thing that's happening in this line. But rather than just having an if statement, it's looking for a get request. And the get request is being processed by the get method of the class all Pokemon. All right. That should have been quite a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and pause here and open up for questions. Go ahead, Alex.
So if the other functions don't exist, like delete and stuff, what will happen if you try and pull delete from there again? It'll just do that.
Yeah, so if I try to access anything else that doesn't exist or that I haven't allowed yet, it's just going to delete. It's just going to send, hey, this method's not allowed. Right? And the only one that I have defined, which is the get method, is the only one that's allowed and is actually sending back a response.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah, so another thing to notice is the request type, right? We're getting 405s of method not allowed. We're not getting 404 errors. We're not getting 500 errors of some sort of internal server error. We're getting this specific method that you're trying to send over a request is not allowed. So even the status response is being handled for us by the API view. Any other questions? All right. If there aren't any other questions, then let's tie in everything else that we've been learning so far. Well, we made a whole serializer that I know I can import. So I'm going to grab my Pokemon serializer, and I'm going to go ahead and grab my Pokemon as well. So there's my model and my serializer that I've just imported. And I actually want to return all of the current Pokemon that exist inside of my database because that's what the user is looking for, right? Well, I could say all Pokemon is equal to Pokemon dot objects dot all. This grabs all of the Pokemon and come back as a query set. All right, I can go and print all Pokemon there. Again, I change this into a get request. I send my request, and you can see that I get back a query set, an iterable query set of 6 objects. Okay, great. Well, now let's say serialized Pokemon. And that's going to have the Pokemon serializer that has all Pokemon. And we can print the serialized Pokemon dot data when we send our request. Oh, I'm getting an error here. So it's telling me, hey, query set is not an instance. Okay. So what mistake am I making here? Can anybody tell me what's wrong with my utilization of the serializer here?
Can your
The
serializer
enable
handle the whole
states.
query set, or does it need the individual objects?
All right, so that's a valid question, right? Can my serializer handle the entire query set, or does it need individual objects? Okay, what else?
Pass the many equals true flag or
Yes.
whatever you call
Perfect. So my serializer can handle the entire query set. I just need to tell it that it needs to handle multiple instances rather than one. And now when I send my request, I finally get back my list of serialized Pokemon. All right, so everything's working so far. Now this is all in JSON format. So I could import JSON response. I could say, hey, I want to have JSON response instead. I can turn this into JSON response and pass in the serializer Pokemon data. I send it, and now I'm getting an error. So in order to allow this, a non-dictionary object has to be serialized. Okay, so now I'm running into issues again, just to make my life a little bit more complicated, where I have to have it nested inside of an actual dictionary. Okay, so there you go. So now it's a JSON response. Now if I send it, it succeeds. But then there's that slight inconvenience that maybe there's times that I don't want things to be nested inside of a parent dictionary. Well, if I wanted to do that with JSON response, there is a way to do it, but I would have to manually write quite a bit of code to get it to work properly. So instead of utilizing JSON response or HTTP response, I'm going to utilize response from REST framework. So I'll go ahead and change this to response. Take off that parental dictionary and send my request. Well, now there's not a parental dictionary in my request. We can see that everything's being processed accordingly. I have Pikachu with no moves. I think only one of them has moves, which is Mewtwo. We can see that Mewtwo has the move of Psychic. All right. So I just converted my view of get request to get all Pokemon, where it queries the database to grab all Pokemon from the database. It then serializes all of those Pokemon and returns all of that data as a JSON response to the user. We've seen this functionality before, right? When I come here and I have this Pokemon Ditto, if I want to send the request, well, although I see this nice pretty portal that they have in the Poke API website, all it is a JSON response where we have all of the details related to one Pokemon. And if I just go to Pokemon in itself and I send my request, you can see that it's still just a dictionary with count, next, previous, and results, where it holds 20 of my Pokemon entries. Right? It's the same exact functionality. If I refresh this on the browser, haven't covered this yet, but if I refresh this on the browser, you'll see that your list comes in exactly the same way. And then you'll notice that there's this nice HTML format. Oh, where's this coming from? Right? Because if I change this back to HTTP response, and I then send my request, everything loads perfectly fine. But the moment I turn this into response and I send it, I get this nice portal that gets me the ability to change my methods. I can click on options, which doesn't show me anything as of now. I can see it in just JSON. Where's this coming from?
Built into the response class from Django?
Yeah, it's actually built into the response class from Django and will only show up if your debug equals true. The moment your debug does not equals true, it's not going to show this. It's just going to show the readily available JSON response. Right, so this is specifically a developer-friendly portal to show you what's going on. It kind of shows me the same thing as my Postman does. Tells me HTTP was of 200 OK, so the status was successful. It shows me the content type that's being sent, and it's telling me it's being accepted. All right. Any questions regarding how to build a API view to get all instances of one specific data entry? Great. If there aren't any questions, then let's go ahead and try to repeat this process for all moves. So I'll go ahead and let you guys guide me through this process. I want to be able to route all moves to an API view that's being triggered inside of my move app. How would I be able to do that? What would be the very first step?
Set up a URL pattern.
Okay, so I come over to my project URLs. And what would this URL pattern look like here, Carlos?
So it would be, and this is for a specific Pokemon you said?
For moves.
For moves. So it would be, would it still be API V1 Pokemon? Well, I'm not sure. Because I'm thinking about getting the moves for a specific Pokemon.
Got it. So I don't want the moves for a specific Pokemon. I just want all the moves that exist inside of my data entry. So let me go
That
ahead.
would just be moves, wouldn't
Yeah, exactly. It would
it?
just
Okay.
be moves. So going along with API convention, we want everything to be a noun pattern and to be pluralized nouns. All right, so now we have my URL pattern that has been established, but now I need a function. What would that function be, Michael? You're muted if you're speaking.
I was just thinking to myself, so you'd have to do the same thing as above, so comma include. Would you also use Pokemon app URLs?
Not in this case, right? Because we want to make sure that all the behavior stays isolated to their independent apps.
Oh, we have a move app. I didn't even see that. So we would do move app.urls.
Perfect. So now that would go to the move app.urls. If I come up here, well, I don't see a URLs file. So what would be next, Daniel?
You would have to go into your Move app and then create a URLs file.
All right, so yeah, I'm gonna go into urls.py.
And then in here, then you're going to have to, this is where you imported that one thing. I'm not sure what the library's name is.
Yeah, it's path.
And then you use that path to, so the first time we went around, we just created a function, but I think we want to do the class, right? Method.
We can, yes. So you want to do that?
So yeah, I'd do the class method because it seems like that was better because it was able to, instead of just a bunch of if statements, we can do like get and all that. So
Okay,
class,
awesome. So before we move into creating our view, what would this URL pattern look like, Chase?
Um, so let's see. Your pattern would be, well, we're not taking any variables like So wouldn't it just be slash moves or like API v1 slash moves? So we're not taking anything specific.
All right, let's go ahead and take a look at what that will do. Nope, that will do it. Right, let me run my server. It looks like everything's working great. Okay, so let's try to ping this URL pattern, right? How would I go about pinging this URL pattern here, Alex?
Mm. You come. Don't know.
All right, awesome. Let me go ahead and pass it on to Keegan.
Ask the question one more time, please.
Yeah, how would I go about getting this actual HTTP response to be triggered? Right, so I have my function, I have a URL pattern. How could I trigger it?
Wouldn't you just create a method, a request method, right below that?
Uh, Not necessarily. I'm not sure. What I'm looking for is what is it that I should type into this URL bar here so I can send my GET request.
Just change Pokemon to moves.
All right, let's try that out. Yeah, we're gonna go ahead and change it from API v1,
Uh,
change it to moves.
You have to do it twice because the way you set it up. It would have to be API v1 moves, API v1 moves,
Let's go ahead and send that
I
twice.
think.
Yeah, now we finally get an HTTP response with moves. Interesting. Well, you just said that we did it twice. Okay.
And you the main in that URLs, you've got API v1 moves. So when you go to that, it points you to this URL, which also tacks on API v1 moves to the end of the pattern.
All right, exactly.
So maybe change the path pattern to an empty string if you want to go to that. Yeah, there we go. Now
Perfect.
that
So now all we have to do is remove that repetitive string and send our request. Fantastic. All right, I heard a hand go up. Was that, does anyone have a question?
Yeah, it's fine. I thought I had a question.
Okay, awesome. All right, so now we have a URL pattern that's able to send a request to moves. But now how do I create an API view that would actually be able to send back all of the moves that I currently have in my database? So let's go ahead and start with this process with J. What would that look like?
Good question. In your moves app, you're gonna have to go to your views.py, and looks like we're gonna use the class method from REST framework. Does that sound right?
It does, yes. All right, so I'm going to import API view. And I'll take care of the import for you. I know we're going to need the response as well.
Yep.
And then since I'm working with all of the moves, what else do I need? Do I need a...
We're gonna need the serializers.
All right. Fantastic.
Nice. Let's go ahead and do a class with, let's name it all moves, and then let's pass in API view from REST framework.
All right.
Let's
Awesome.
do let's do a
I'm gonna cut
Uh,
you off there, Jay.
oh, I'm sorry.
I'm gonna steal your thunder and pass it off to someone else. All right, Aaron, what would be the next steps here?
Um, do a get function,
All right, so we're gonna create a method for get that will
and
take
since it's in a class, it needs itself and the request that's being passed in. Um, gonna define or yeah, pick a variable that's going to be passed back, so like moves. And then that has to go through serializer, right?
all right.
And then it's whatever was called objects all, the singular move, yeah. And then many is true, so that we get it all back. And then you return that moves.
All right, return response. Just moves or a specific attribute of moves?
The data.
Moves
And
that.
then you'll have to call that or import that class in the URLs as well.
All right. Awesome. So now we just go ahead and include it. We add all moves, and then very important for everybody to remember, we need the ass view method. All right. Well, let's see what happens now. Well, when I send my request now I get my serialized response of the move psychic that currently exists within my database. So now, if I were to publish my API, anybody who wants to access my API would have access to all of my Pokemon with all of their data, and they would have access to all of my moves and all of their data. So we just created a get method to be able to handle get requests for both moves and Pokemon. All right, go ahead, Michael.
Maybe I missed it. Is there a reason why there's only one move showing up?
We only have one move inside of the database.
Oh, okay. All right. That makes sense.
Yes. If I come over here, let me go
I
ahead.
think you mentioned it earlier that only one move is showing up, but I wasn't sure of the reason why.
Yeah, let me go ahead and make sure here. Yeah, we only have one. And then when it comes to Pokemon, we should have those 6 entries that we saw. Or 5 entries, I apologize. Andy?
Um, I don't know if I'm going ahead. Let me know and stop me. But for the URL patterns, it seems like it should be able to hold more than just one path. Is that the purpose of it?
Yes, that's correct. So next we're gonna go over how to grab. Oh, what is going on here? Zoom. Hello. All right. Next, we're gonna go over how to grab one independent instance with URL parameters. All right. Any other questions? Perfect. If there are no questions, let me go ahead and pause our recording here. Welcome back, everyone. For the second portion of our lecture, we're going to talk about creating a singular API view for a singular instance and a singular move. We'll then talk about testing API endpoints. And if we have some time allotted towards the end, we're going to go over what URL converters are and how to create our own. All right, let's dive into this. So for getting an instance, in Django URL, we have the parameter where we can either pass in string or we can pass in integers. Now, in order to get a specific instance, we need to know what to query the database by and the value we're looking for, whether it be by title or by primary key. Okay, so there we can see the RESTful API convention, which is of 1. The argument that gets passed into the actual view will be the ID. And then the select query that happens is where the primary key is equal to ID. Does anyone have any questions about that so far? Great. Well, what if we wanted to bring later on, we'll go into covering how we could create one that can accept either string or integers and still be valid. We'll do that utilizing the converter. Now we'll start talking about testing. So just like our models, it is imperative that we test our API endpoints by mocking or pinging their behavior. It may seem like an extra unnecessary work, but as our project becomes more complex, running unit tests will give us the extra layer of security to ensure we didn't break anything in our app. All right. So let's dive in straight right in. Right now, I'm going to run Python manage py test to make sure all my tests are passing. It looks like both of my tests have officially passed. And now I'm going to go ahead and create a singular view there. Well, you notice it's not really going to be much of a difference, right? My Pokédex project, I have my urls.py, which is already routed to my Pokemon app.urls. So I can come to my Pokemon app, URLs, and here I can simply add, hey, I want to be able to grab by ID. So I can say, hey, in here, I'm going to accept the ID of said Pokemon, which will be an integer type ID, and close it. Now for a view, I can make my a Pokemon view. And I know this is going to be a class-based view, so I could just name it as such. Go over to my views and actually create said view. I'm actually going to move this up above so that it doesn't get in the way. So I'll create a class, a Pokemon view, which will inherit from API view. This should all seem familiar so far. We'll create my get request, which is self and request. We're going to have a Pokemon, which is going to come by querying the database. So I'm going to say Pokemon dot objects dot get, where ID is equal to, and then I'll leave it as a question mark for now. From there, I'm going to serialize said Pokemon, which is going to utilize my Pokemon serializer, where the data will be a Pokemon. And then I'll simply return a response with that serialized Pokemon dot data. So all of this should look pretty familiar so far. But there's a little bit of connection that we need to do here. So if I come to my Pokemon app, I can see that I've imported a Pokemon. And the class-based view is now plugged in. But I have this parameter that I'm passing in. And I know this is a parameter because of what syntax?
The greater than, less than.
Yeah, my arrow brackets, right? And what type of parameter am I passing in? Is this going to be a string or an integer?
Should be an integer.
Great, we're passing in an integer, and we know the parameter name is ID. Well, let's go back to take a look at a previous example here. When we're taking an integer base and height for our triangle function, or excuse me, our triangle view, we also passed it in into the view so that it can expect those arguments. So what needs to change here in this class-based view?
It needs to accept another variable.
Yeah, great. It needs to accept another variable. And that other variable needs to be of ID. Well, then the question is, why ID? That's the wrong URLs. Here you go. Well, we're naming it ID because here, the integer ID that I'm passing in, the variable that it's going to account for is ID. So this ID must match the same exact one that's being passed here. All right. Well, now I have the ID, so I can actually grab in the ID that's being passed in through my request, and I can return that one Pokemon. Well, let's take a look here. I'm going to go ahead and run my project. When I run my server, I can come over to Pokemon, send my requests. You'll see that I have multiple IDs. Well, if I wanted to grab Blastoise, what would be the next URL point that I want to send a request to?
Scroll down. 5. Add a 5 at the after the backslash.
Perfect.
Maybe.
Out of 5. We send our request, and now we receive Blastoise. And only Blastoise. All right. Awesome. This should look very familiar to what we did for our Rick and Morty API, right? When we did all characters, we pinged their general characters page and had to deal with pagination. But then when we had to look at a character detail, we did an on-click functionality that passed that character's ID onto the use params. We then pulled it out from the router, and utilizing Axios, we made a separate request where we included that character ID. Well, it's the same exact or a similar functionality that's happening in the backend as well. We're still receiving the URL where we're grabbing the ID from a URL parameter, pulling it out, and utilizing it to query the database. All right, great. Well, now that we did this for Pokemon, how do we do it for moves? And I'll go ahead and start calling on people at this point. Let's hear, I'm just going to go from bottom to top. Starting off with Justin.
Sorry, I'm still catching up.
Oh, no problem at all. All right, Nick, what would be the first thing to do here?
Would you open up what we just did with a Pokemon? Because we're just going to copy that exactly and just route it differently and name things slightly different.
Okay, which file would you like to take a look at?
So we got all Pokemon, a Pokemon right there. Okay, so a Pokemon. We're basically going to take that and we're going to put it in the views, but instead of, because we're in Pokemon app, we want to go to the move app and make a move view.
You want me to open them up side by side?
Yes, please.
All right.
Class A move, close parentheses, API view, colon, we're going to make a get. It's going to be exactly the same, self, request, and ID. A underscore move is equal to move dot objects dot get, where ID is equal to ID. We're going to serialize the move, so ser move equals move serializer. And then a move is going to be inside there.
Right.
Excellent. Return response serialize move. Then
I'm going to cut you off right there, Nick. So Nick already has built out our view for us. But now we actually need to route to this view. So let's go over that. Kevin, are you currently here? I don't see you on screen.
I am here. I'm still catching up too. I'm still trying to figure this part out.
Okay, no problem. But what would be next?
Okay, so we need to go to the URLs page for this file.
All right, let's go over to the URLs. And I see Okino, you've taken over. Let's do it. All right, so we're at the URLs file.
That you actually called me. It would be actually the same format. It would be path, the URL.
All right, so path.
And in this particular case, I don't think we need. In this particular case, I don't think we need to pass any URL because we're in the same folder. And I think think the Pokemon projects is gonna manage that URL. So yeah, we do need to import from the views. And then again, there's no URL, so we leave it as an empty string and pass the actual class, which is going to be a moves dot as view. Because essentially what we want to do is, of course, we want to pass that same class and convert it to an actual, as you said, functional view instead of a class view, which is what it is right now.
All right, awesome. So let's go ahead and try this out. So currently, the endpoint that exists is going to be of moves. And if I send that request, well, currently it looks like I'm getting a list of dictionaries, and I should only be getting one object. So maybe there's something going on.
That's still right? It's when you slap a move ID on the end of your URL is where we're gonna have an issue, right? Because it's not gonna work in your GET request.
Well, so how it is now is there's only one move in the entire list, but if there were more, it would be showing more right now.
Yeah,
So
so
what you need to do is add a parameter to the URL then.
perfect. And what would be
And
that?
then syntax for that is open and closed. Yeah. And then within that is the parameter, which is going to be, I think, ID. It's going to be int.id.
All right, great. So now we can go ahead and go towards the end, put in one, send our request, and now we get our independent move. Fantastic.
Would you show what it does if you look for move two in a GET request?
Absolutely. So if I go for move two, I actually get an error, right? And this is going to be an internal error. It's going to be error 500. And there's a way to handle that. So I'm glad you asked that question. So currently the way we're querying the database is we're querying the database by grabbing with this objects function, move.objects, etc., etc. But Django knows that one of the biggest reasons why people choose to work with Django is because of its ORM functionality. So it actually created a shortcut called get object or 404. And what this will do is it will either grab an object from the database or it will return a 404 error. So if we use that, we can use get object or 404. And then here we can specify the class, which is move, and then specify the argument where ID is equal to ID. So now if I send my request for 2, I get a 404. No moves matches the given query. I didn't have to handle it myself or do a try and accept. Instead, I just let Django do all the heavy lifting for me. All right, where I utilize a shortcut saying get object or 404. If the move doesn't exist, it returns a successful response. If the move, or excuse me, it returns an error, a 404 error. And if the move does exist, it returns the actual move. Now, why is it important for us to highlight the difference between 404 and 500?
500 is supposed to be a server error, and that it's not a server error if someone's requesting an ID that doesn't exist necessarily.
All right. So the difference between 404 and 500 is 404 is we couldn't find the query that you were looking for, right? Now, there's also a different error code, which I believe is 400, which means improper request or wrong formatted request. I can't remember off the top of my head. Now, status codes are very useful for developers for them to understand where the error is actually happening and why the error is happening. So we don't want to mislead other developers or clients or anyone, right? If we receive a request for something, we want to make sure that we're returning the proper response. If I'm returning a response 500 for me not having an ID that they're looking for, well, that's not telling the user, oh, my ID doesn't exist. That's telling the user, oh, they messed up in the backend and I should submit a ticket or I should let somebody know that this is failing, right? Whereas 404, that means, oh, okay, well, this function works. They didn't mess up in the backend, right? I didn't mess up in my request. The issue is that the argument that I'm looking for doesn't exist. Right? So those status codes become very important as we're working through building our API. All right, great. Well, let's apply that same logic to our Pokemon view here. We're gonna go ahead and get object or 404. And we can apply that down here. We'll say get object or 404, pass in the Pokemon model, and then our argument that we're looking for where ID is equal to ID. And make sure that that works as well. Let's go over to Pokemon. And there we can get Pikachu. Fantastic. Well, now we successfully created this get functionality to be able to grab a Pokemon by ID. But what we're trying to replicate is actually the Poke API. And the Poke API, well, I can pass in one to get all the information regarding Bulbasaur, but I can also pass in Bulbasaur and get all the information pertaining to Bulbasaur. Well, Django doesn't have that capability naturally. Django can't parse through integer and string on its own. So I have to build something that will be able to parse through integer and string. These are called converters. Ideally, we would put them in their own file to make sure that everything is being tracked properly. But to keep things easily readable, we're going to go ahead and write it all in here. So I'm going to go ahead and write this class that would be called integer or string converter. This class isn't going to inherit anything. It's just a simple class that because we want it to be a converter, it needs to have two methods. One, the toPython method, which is going to take self and a value. And the other is the toURL method, which is going to take in self and a value. So one of them is how to communicate with the Python code, and the other is how to communicate with our URL patterns. All right, so when it comes to our URL patterns, it's pretty simple. Right? All we want to do is we want to return the string of value. Even if it's an integer or whatever it's coming in, we want to explicitly specify this is going to be interpreted as a string. All right. Now the toPython function. This part becomes a little bit more complex, right? In the toPython function, well, I want to check if my value is a digit. And let me specify this because everything will be naturally interpreted as a string. So I should make sure that that gets specified first. I know that everything's going to get naturally interpreted as a string because one, it's a URL pattern. And also I'm explicitly saying, hey, this will be interpreted as a string down below. So I can say, hey, if the value is a digit, then I want to return the integer of value. And else I want to return the string of value. Or I could just put value if I really wanted to. So this is the way that my regex converter, or excuse me, that my converter would be able to accept both integer and string without me having to explicitly choose one or the other. But there's one more attribute that a converter is. Oh, go ahead, Andy.
Kind of confused. When you're plugging it into the, let's say the web browser, the URL, is it by default taking it as a string or integer? I'm confused.
When I'm plugging in the URL into the browser. Oh, I see. So you're saying like in here?
The one, is that taken in as a string value?
By default, it's always going to be taken in as a string.
So this is the reason why we're doing the converter?
Yes. So originally we're converting it with integer, right? But what we're trying to do is we're trying to mock the Poke API. Currently, the Poke API is able to accept both string and integer endpoints.
Right.
As of now, our converter can accept either integer or string, but not both. So right now what we're creating is the ability to accept both.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Of course. All right. Now, as I was saying, the last thing that we want is a regex pattern. And what this regex pattern is going to do is it's going to define what exactly it is that we're able to accept within this portion. All right, so this integer ID actually holds a regex pattern that looks like this, 0 through 9, where it has 1 or more, right? And where a string pattern would look something like, hey, I can accept A through Z, 1 or more, or I can accept A through Z or A through Z with 1 or more. All right, so that would be the difference between our string pattern and our integer pattern. But in this case, we want to be able to accept this regex to take in both integer and string. So what would this regex look like?
Basically, we just wrote down.
Basically what? What I just wrote down? Yeah. We would do 0 through 9, or A through Z, A through Z, 1 or more. Right? This one belongs to only string, and this one belongs to only integer. Well, now we can accept both. So now we've created this class that's able to accept both of them. We'll have to change a little bit inside of our Pokemon view as well. There's a little bit of refactoring that's happening here. Now I can actually register this converter by saying from dot converters, or excuse me, this is going to be in Django URLs. It's going to be called register converter. And what we do is we say register converter, where we pass in the class as the first argument, which in this case is going to be the integer or string converter, and then we assign it to a variable, which in this case I'll say int string. I see a hand up, Carlos. Let me go ahead and finish this thought process and I'll come back to you. So now I can just change my view. Say path. Instead of integer, I can say integer string and then ID. Did I misspell regex?
Do you need to do it as a raw string at R for regex?
No, that wasn't the issue there.
Okay. Well, that was going to be my question anyway. So.
Okay, yeah, I had it as a.
Is the OR double pipe or single pipe in regex?
I believe single pipe.
Okay.
Yeah, there you are. Okay. So the problem was that I had it inside of the function. It was a scoping issue. It was a function variable where it was supposed to be a class attribute. All right, so that was my syntax error. Okay, so now I finished my thought process, and let me actually go ahead and test this out. We're going to go ahead and send this request with still the integer of 1, make sure that works. We send it with 5, that still works. And then we'll go into covering the string portion here shortly and changing our view. Carlos, go ahead, send your question.
It was since the regex, it didn't have the R for the raw string. I was just wondering if it needed it.
Got it.
Or why it doesn't if it doesn't need it.
So it doesn't need it because in this register converter, it's going to pass it into that class. Oh man, where's it at? Inside of this register converter, essentially, it looks for that class attribute and then turns it into a raw string. So it happens
Okay.
with this register converter function.
Yeah. Thanks.
Of course. All right. Well, now let's take a look at our view and let's update it so that it can accept arguments such as name for Pikachu or Blastoise. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check if type ID is equal to, or I can just check is instance. That might be easier. So let's do a Pokemon be equal to none. If the instance is of integer, it will do as such. Else, because the only two things that are allowed is integer or string, I'll say a Pokemon is equal to get object or 404. Well, I ask for the Pokemon, and the ID, or excuse me, the name will be equal to ID dot type. So now let's test it out. Let's make sure this didn't break anything. I send it to the number 5, I still get a good response. Send it to number 1, I still get Pikachu. Well, now what happens if I put in Blastoise? Well, now it still returns Blastoise. Right? So the request is going in through my URL patterns. It goes through that converter that I've just registered, analyzes that it fits the regex. In Python, we ask, hey, is this a digit? It is not a digit, so we return the string value to Python. In views, I ask, hey, is this an instance of an integer? It is not. So a Pokemon is equal to a Pokemon that has the name of the ID, which is Blastoise, in title format, which is the only regex that we're allowing into our actual database according to our validators. And then we serialize our Pokemon and return the data. So just like that, I can grab my Pokemon either through spelling out their name or by passing in their actual integer ID. All right, go ahead, Michael.
Pikachu is lowercase. Will that cause an issue with the title function?
Could cause an issue. And that is why it is important to make sure that our database is clean. So let me go ahead and take a look at our fixtures. We pull up our Pokemon data. So I'm assuming that these were created before we went over our validators. So because they were created before we went through our validators, they were able to accept proper input. So I can easily come through and change them. I can also build a script that would change them where I could grab all the Pokemon, iterate through all of them, and then put all of them inside of title format. This is more like a data engineering task, right? But because there's only a couple of entries, I can simply Python manage py load data from Pokemon app fixtures and Pokemon data. All right, so that installed all of my fixtures. Now that I have fixed my data to make sure that everything's properly inside of my database, I can go ahead and type in Pikachu.
Would you have gotten a 4-4 if you didn't change that?
I would have, yes.
Okay.
All right, and I'm assuming that also answered your question, Daniel?
It did.
All right, great. So now we just went over creating a converter that would be able to accept both integer and string. We also went over how to create that argument and actually apply it to our path. In our views, we went ahead and actually changed our logic to account for the possibility of it being an integer or the possibility of it being a string. Now, in our documentation, we can specify that people can grab a Pokemon through either ID or name. Does anyone have any other questions regarding how we created our singular API view for one specific instance and how we went over into registering a converter? Andy, go ahead.
Um, Was the converter necessary to achieve this, or would you have been able to make a separate path for two different entries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way that Django works, and I can demonstrate this utilizing the move app. That way we're not changing any of our code that does work. So if I come over to the move app, and I'm gonna go ahead and do this URLs. All right, so currently I'm able to grab through an integer, all right? Well, let's say I change it. Let's say path. What I want is a string type. And then here I'm going to say name of move, right? Well, in this name of move, I'm going to have a lambda function that will return an HTTP response for move. Oh, this one is actually going to take in more than that, x comma y. Okay. So now this is going to be here, I'll spell it out. That way it doesn't become confusing. They received the request, and then we also have our name. All right. Well, let's go into the move and see how this works. If I go into move and I send 1, well, now I'm getting a 404 not found. Interesting. Oh, and that's because it's not moves. Okay. So there it is. The ID of 1 becomes psychic. All right. What happens if I want psychic? I expect an HTTP response saying psychic. And that's what I get back. So I can actually just have overlapping parameters there to trigger different functions or different views, right? You can see there that I passed it in with either an integer or a name, and it was able to react exactly the same. I can still have this saying a move, so I could achieve the same exact functionality doing it this way. But the difference would be that I would be writing this path twice. And then in a move, I might want to create a separate function to account for this ID, since the parameter might be different. Either that, or I could utilize quarks if you want to take a look into that. Does that answer your question, Andy? Of
Yes, thank you.
course. All right. Awesome. Well, now for the last portion of our lecture, we're going to actually dive into test cases here. So I'm going to come over. I'm going to close my Move app. I'm going to close my Pokédex app. And to manage my test cases better, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to do a little bit of isolation. I'm not going to need Postman anymore, so I'm just going to get rid of it. Well, here inside of my Pokédex project, I'm going to make a directory named tests. And inside this directory, I'm going to make a model test. So I'm going to change directory into test, and then I'm going to touch test underscore models.py. And I'm going to grab my model test. That I have already created. All right. And I'm going to specify that this is from the Pokemon app dot models to make sure that everything works great. Then I'm going to do the same thing for my Move app, which I believe has test. Actually, it doesn't, so that's okay. And this is just to isolate that. So now I'm just going to go ahead and run Python. Oh, Python manage py test, and then we'll specify the directory of tests. This is because of a virtual environment. So I have to close this one here. So it looks like it was able to run my test and test them both successfully for my model. Now, why am I doing this? Why am I moving this test directory into test models? It's pretty much the same application as everything else. We want to make sure that we're isolating our scripts as much as possible and isolating the behavior. So now that I've tested my models, well, I can go ahead and test my API points. So I'm going to go ahead and do test URLs.py. And in this test URLs.py, I'm going to write a couple of test cases here. So I'm going to say from Django.test, I want to import test case. And then I'll go into writing my very first test. Well, the very first things that I want to do is I want to actually ensure that I have the proper URL pattern for each route. And that I have the proper class for each route. So let's do that. Let's do def test URLs. This is going to take in test case. And this is going to be a class, not. There you go. And for my very first method, I'll do test 001, making sure all Pokemon exist. And this will take in self. Well, there's a couple of things to take into consideration. So one, and I'll write it out here. How do I grab a URL pattern from within Django? And two is how do I trigger its, we'll say, functionality / completion from path. Because now we're working backwards, right? We're calling it from within Django. So it's not like we're just sending an API view, we're actually sending an API request. So how do I build this test case? Well, for the first one, what we'll utilize is something called reverse. And for the second, we'll use something called resolve. Both of these come from Django.urls. Now, resolve will trigger the functionality or the completion of the path that's attached to this. And reverse will actually find the path that we're looking for. But reverse requires a little bit more from our path. Let's go into that. Say my URL is equal to reverse. And you'll see that reverse is expecting a view name. Interesting. Well, I've seen that somewhere before. Let me go check out my Pokédex projects and come into URLs. Well, I see that there's a route, there's a view, and then the last parameter that I can add to a path is name. Okay, well, I haven't added name into anything. So let me go ahead and go into my Pokemon app, open up the URLs. I'm going to add a name. I'm going to say name be equal to all Pokemon. I don't have to follow snake casing here. I can just name this all Pokemon like this. And in my test URLs, well, it expects that same exact convention. I want to see all Pokemon. Well, let's go ahead and print the URL there. For now, let's do assert true and pass in true. just so we could see it. All right, so I'll do Python manage py test test. And in here, what I want to do is my urls.py. Oh, excuse me, this was expecting a Pythonic path, not a direct path. Okay, Python manage py. Oh, I see the issue. Okay, and we can see that one was resolved. And when I print that URL, well, look at that. I can see that the URL pattern that's been attached to it is APY V1 Pokemon, which is what we have here. Right? This is API V1 Pokemon. Everything that came prior to this that attached me to here is API V1 Pokemon. This is where the endpoint ends. And it triggers a view. Good. So now I'm able to grab the URL. But that doesn't necessarily give me too much information. Let's see what happens when I say resolved URL and pass this into resolve with the URL. And then we print that out. Give me a second here. All right, I run my test. And now with the result URL, I have a function, I have arguments, I have corgs, I have URL name, app names that have been passed into it, and route. Great, so by resolving it, I'm actually able to take a look at much more information than just by calling the reverse function. All right, go ahead, Andy.
I was wondering, is the name for the path made specifically to do tests, or is there other function to that?
There is another function to it. If you're utilizing Django templates, you could call specific links utilizing the name parameter. That way it can link to other views that are serving or rendering HTML. But
Okay.
that's so there's Django templates, there's tests, and I believe there's one other functionality, but I can't remember it off the top of my head.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. All right. Well, now that I have this information, I can actually start writing some meaningful test. First, I want to say with subtest, which is running a test within the test. I can assert equals or assert equal that the URL route, or excuse me, the resolved URL route is equal to API/v1/Pokemon, and that remains the same. And then once that test passes, I can ask for my entire test to assert true that URL, the function that's being passed in, which is a view class, is all Pokemon. And I would just have to import that. So from Django dot, oh, excuse me, from Pokemon app dot views, import all Pokemon. Well, now if I run my test, I see that we have a little misconstruction here. So I'm getting an assert, which is failing, and it's not failing. The test isn't actually failing. What's failing? The assert equal, missing one positional argument. So this one goes like this. All right. And then I'm getting another error, which is URL func class view. And that's because I'm calling URL instead of the resolved URL. So URL is just a string, whereas the resolved URL is an actual object. So both of those were errors. That's why I got E's instead of F's. And now when I run it, my test passes. All right. Resolve gives me all the information pertaining this URL pattern that I'm looking for. That way I have an object that I can actually check the function that's attached to it and the URL pattern. Does anyone have any questions regarding how we were able to reverse call that API endpoint and grab that information? Okay. Doesn't look like anybody has any questions. So now let's go into testing our reviews. I'm going to create a new file here. I'm going to name this test views.py. This is going to look a little bit repetitive. From Django.test, I'm going to import test case. And what I can do now is I can actually create an answers. So I'm going to touch into test and answers.py. And in this answers.py, I'm just going to take my resolved from those API endpoints. I know they work now. So I can go ahead and let me bring that over here so that it's a little bit closer. I apologize to everyone. I know it's a lot of screens moving around, but I am running out of time here. All right. So we know that I can ask for a psychic. So this would be my answer for psychic. I can copy said answer. And in this answers.py, I can say a move and paste that answer. Okay. For all moves, I know it's going to be the same exact thing, just inside of a parental parentheses. Awesome. Now I can grab a Pokemon. And for a Pokemon, I can pass in something like 6, which should give us Mewtwo. Be careful with these true or with these Boolean variables. You have to make sure the capitalization is good. And then I can pass in all Pokemon. I can copy it, bring it back. Okay, and they all been changed into false. Awesome. So now we have all the answers for all of our views. And we can actually go into testing them. And I just realized I don't have pictures for my move app, do I? I do not. Let me go ahead and fix that as well. So I'm going to change directory into my move app. Make some fixtures. There's a little bit of setup that I have to do for these for these tests. And now I can say Python manage py dump data. And I want to dump from the move app dot move. I want to make sure I indent by 2. I gotta dump this into the move app, fixtures, moves, fixtures, .json. And this might fail. Okay, it doesn't seem like it failed. There's my moves fixtures. So there's my move that exists now. Now, why am I creating fixtures? What's the whole point of that? I have these fixtures that, yeah, they're useful for backing up my data a little bit, but we both know that they're not, or we all know that they're not going to be useful as far as taking me further than some mock data for development. So why even go through the trouble of making them? Well, they're super important when we're writing tests. Here I'm going to go ahead and do from Django.urls. I'm going to import reverse. And then from answers, I want to import all. And answers is just the answers file that we have created. All right. We can even go as far as to specify that this is from test.answers. Now let's go into building our actual test case here. So I'm going to have a class of test case, or excuse me, of test views that will take in test case. Now this class is actually going to need some sort of fixtures. Otherwise, its data is going to be empty. We'll see that here shortly. We're going to create test 001, which is get all Pokemon. This test will take in self. And now we have a couple of questions to ask ourselves. One, how do I send a request to a reverse call? Because we have a way to activate that function now because of that reverse call. And then two, what content type is the body of the response? All right. Now, let's start off with the first one. How do I send a request to a reverse call? This is specific for writing test cases. Who's going to be sending calls to your API? Right? The typical terminology for who's sending calls to your API is a client. Well, test case comes in with a mock client that's able to send requests. So I can say simply my response, which should look very similar to what we saw when we were utilizing Axios. We're going to utilize client. We can say client is equal to client. Now that is a class, so we have to make an instance of it. Say client dot get to a reverse call to all Pokemon. We already saw reverse before. The only new portion here is client. And this dot get, well, they're just sending a get request to this reverse call. Well, now let's print response. And let's self.assert true, true. Let's see, Python, manage py, test dot test views. Okay, so we can see only one of them came back. It came back successfully, and that's because I did self.assert true. We also see that there's a status code there of 200. So maybe that's something we want to check. So we could say with self.subtest, we want to self.assert equal response dot status code and 200 to make sure that works. Okay, so that seems to have worked. If we change this to 400, we'll see that that fails because 200 is not equal to 400. Great. Well, now let's go ahead and take a look at the body of this. Let's go ahead and print response.body. Or excuse me, response.content. Well, response.content, a couple of things to highlight there. What's the content type that I'm receiving back?
A binary string?
Yeah, I'm receiving a binary string. So that tells me that I'm going to need to utilize JSON.loads. So I need to import JSON. And we'll use that later on. But there's a separate issue.
It's empty.
Empty. Yeah.
Empty list.
I'm receiving an empty list when I know there's Pokemon in my database. Well, what's happening?
You hit the API, but did you give it a parameter? No.
So this one doesn't accept parameters.
Yeah, it doesn't need one, right? Because we're going all Pokemon.
So what's actually happening here is, and I want everyone to notice, down below, we're actually creating a test database. And this test database is completely empty. It doesn't hold any information that my actual database does.
You got to do some setup, right? Like seed some data.
I do. So the way we're going to put data into my database for this test case is by utilizing my fixtures. Here I can say I have Pokemon data.json. And I believe I called it move data. I called it move fixtures. And I have moves fixtures .json. Well, now let's see what happens when I run my test. Well, now when I run my test, I get some actual response that has Pikachu and all my other Pokemon. And if you take a look here, it looks like Mewtwo doesn't have any moves, but we know Mewtwo is supposed to hold a move to my other our other move of Psychic. So let me go ahead and take a look at the fixtures and make sure that they're all up to date, because there's a good chance that Mewtwo is not. So Mewtwo is not up to date. So that's where the issue is coming from. All right, so let me go ahead and update our fixtures now. Let's dump data from the Pokemon app dot Pokemon dash dash indent to, we want to dump this into the Pokemon app fixtures Pokemon data.json. All right, and now let's come down and take a look at Mewtwo one more time. Well, Mewtwo now has moves. Great. And now if I go back into testing and I take a look at Mewtwo, oh, now Mewtwo also has a move. All right, so that was just a user error from my end. I did not update my fixtures, so that's good about making test cases. I can see the errors that I'm making. I see a hand up. Go ahead, Daniel.
So I saw that in student project 6, they had it like built into a test folder. They had the fixtures plus all the different tests, plus where it was going to get where it's expecting its response to be an answer, but the answer was also in its own file. How would we implement that into our student project, basically?
Interesting. So basically, the only difference would be where your fixtures are located. Is that correct?
Yes, they had their fixtures in the test file, but like I'm not sure how to. They had a test directory, same as like yours, but it was not directly put into the student app, or it wasn't put into the school project. I was just trying to see how to implement it into the actual project itself.
Oh,
Because where you're entering it in, you're entering into the student or the Pokédex app inside of the project, but how would I implement an overall arching test inside of the like your Pokédex project then?
yeah, it would have to be within the same module as your project directory, just like I did here, right? So this is the Pokédex project, which is the parent module, but then here's my actual project that holds settings and everything else. And then adjacent to that is my tests.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, it could be possible that I'm misunderstanding your question. If so, we could always just take a look at it in a one-on-one.
All right, thank you.
Of course. All right. Well, now I have my content that's working well. So now I can say my response body is equal to JSON.loads response.content. And now I can say I want to self.assert equal my response body. And I know that I have my all Pokemon answer. And my all Pokemon answer is coming in from answers. So now I can go ahead and test my tests here. Oh, and I can see that it passed. So my all Pokemon API endpoint is working. All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and speed through this A Pokemon endpoint, and then I'll open it up for questions for clarity. So here I'm going to go ahead and write my test 002, which is going to be get a Pokemon. It's going to follow almost the same exact syntax, right? Where we're going to have a client, which is equal to a client. We're going to have a response, which is equal to client dot get. That's going to have a reverse call. We don't have that reverse call yet. I can write the same subtest. So with self.subtest, I want to self.assert equal that response.status code is of 200 because that's what I expect for a get request. And then I can go ahead and say, well, I want my response body to be equal to JSON.loads response.content. And then I can finally self.assert equal my response body and a Pokemon. All right. Well, now the question is, how are we doing this reverse call? Again, I come over to my URLs. I would add a name. Let's make this a little bit different. Let's just say single Pokemon. Come over to test views. And here I would specify this is a single Pokemon. But notice that I'm also expecting a parameter in this URLs of ID. Well, the way I pass in parameters is inside of the reverse function, I would pass in as a second argument, arguments. And in order, I would pass in something like Blastoise. All right, let me go ahead and actually print some of this information so we can see how it works here. And actually, I'm going to do it this way so that we could see the reverse call in action. We'll print the URL, and then we'll print the response body. We'll go ahead and send our test there. All right, so it looks like we have a failure here. And that failure is because I asked for the wrong Pokemon on the answer that I've inputted here. So let me go ahead and send 5 for Blastoise. Oh, it's not running, so that would fail, of course. So you'll see that the answers that I have are for Mewtwo, when in reality I wanted Blastoise. Actually, it might be easier if I just change the test instead. Let me just change this here really quickly here. Let's go over to Mewtwo. And then I'll send my test. Okay, there you go. So I was able to pass. So we can see here that URL pattern that I'm printing goes to API/v1/Pokemon, and then the args get inputted for Mewtwo. Right, so that args argument is how you provide parameters, those URL parameters. Great. We then we send our request. You can see Mewtwo being populated down below in our response body, and it matches our answer for a Pokemon. At this point, does anyone have any questions over how to write tests for your API views? All right, if no one has any questions, today we covered what are views, linking URL patterns to apps and views, creating the all Pokemon functional view. We then turned that all Pokemon functional view into a class-based view. We created the all moves class-based view. We went to creating the a Pokemon view, the a move view, and then we covered how to test API endpoints and URL patterns. Finally, we additionally covered how to register a new URL converter to allow us to accept both integer and string. At this point, does anyone have any questions over anything we covered in today's lecture? If no one has any questions, which it looks like we don't, let me go ahead and check Slack to make sure there are no questions in the questions channel. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions. Let me go ahead and stop the recording here.